All right, welcome everyone to our week 9 lecture presentation. This week we are continuing to look into literary criticism in terms of our literary analysis essay. You should be able to find the essay description in course documents, and I've also uploaded a list of links to different authors you might consider. So let's go ahead and get started with this week's presentation. So keep in mind, for this week we do have a quiz over list 5, and that will be posted to the assignments and quizzes area of the class, as well as course documents. Remember, we do have a discussion board this week that you will be working to analyze film that you have seen of your choice. We have some reading this week on page 78 to 89 that should help you in the drafting process of writing. And then, of course, keep in mind that essay 4 is due at the end of week 11 unless circumstances find us moving the date. So those are just some things to keep in mind this week. I did want to talk about the essay itself, so let's look at this description. So as our textbook defines it, a literary analysis, quote, shares with readers some insights about an aspect of a poem, play, story, or novel, end quote. And the literary analysis describes what an author says and how he or she says it. And that analysis is created through your own point of view about the work. So analysis will look at the literary elements utilized, how the author uses those elements, and what the use of those elements says about the overall work. So you're looking at a work, picking it apart basically in terms of its literary elements, and then putting it back together by creating a point of view about the work. So analyzing a literary work can take on a lot of different forms, which we're going to talk about those forms with this presentation. So for instance, you can analyze a work's setting and themes through the lens of a historical perspective. So how does the setting relate to the world in which the author lived? Or what is the historical context of the story? How do the themes relate to the issues that the author dealt with in everyday life? Other things you could do is analyze the characters and literary devices with a political perspective. So how do the characters' point of view remind you of a specific political ideology? How did the literary devices uphold that idea? Did the work have an impact on politics at the time? So on and so forth. So you're looking at a work through a specific type of lens. Now, when we think about our essay, for the description and the assignment, you are going to analyze the theme or the literary devices or the plot and setting or the historical context of a work within our textbook or an author from our textbook. You could choose one from the Crowder Library, or if you have another work of your choice that you would like to pursue. Now, you're welcome to find short works of fiction or creative essays from the Crowder Library or other online sources. Please contact me via email, or you could shoot me a text so I can approve your choice. So one of the things I've already told some students is that I do not want you to analyze a work that we've already discussed in the discussion board. So we're not going to use The Story of an Hour. We're not going to use Out and Audre Lorde's 4th of July. We're not using those, but you can definitely use those authors. So look at other works that they've written and other works that are from our book that we haven't discussed in the discussion board, and those would be fine. So the analysis needs to be 4 to 5 pages. MLA formatting, like every other paper. You're going to create a clear critique of the work with a specific focus. So you need to be able to critique the actual work you chose, but you need to have some sort of focus, whether that's literary devices, historical context, theme, that kind of thing. Or you can choose one of the literary criticisms that we're going to talk about with this presentation. It is worth 150 points. you need to use at least 2 sources outside the story that you choose. Now I put novel here, but we're not choosing novels. I've decided that that's probably not the greatest idea considering how much time we have for the paper. So it should be a shorter work, story, essay, poem, that kind of thing. Your paper should be double spaced, 12-point font, Times New Roman. It needs to contain MLA formatting and a title page. And though we are discussing film in our discussion board this week, we are not going to include film as one of the options for analysis. So that was just a way to allow you to look at something within your scope of understanding and modern context, but we are going to use written works for this analysis. So, like I had mentioned, I did post a Word document that has a bunch of different author choices available from our textbook and just things that I have been thinking about. I also included several links that would be reliable source material to find information about those authors and some different works that they have done. So the authors that I recommended are Maya Angelou, Robert Frost, Stephen King, Cherokee Paul McDonald, Kate Chopin, Langston Hughes, Audre Lorde, and Mario Suarez. This is not the only group of authors that you can choose from. This is just some suggestions based on what our textbook provides and just my own selection. So just keep that in mind. Now, I also have provided some links below that are just kind of overviews of different literary analysis. So there's one about Victorian literature. There's a lot of great poets during that time frame and other writers, short story writers and things. Think Charles Dickens kind of thing. There's AmericanLiterature.com. There's a website called Writers Inspire that talks about feminist approaches to literature, which might be interesting. There's the Postcolonial Web, which talks about postcolonial literature. So that's based on works that were written within countries that were once colonies of, generally speaking, England, Spain, that kind of thing. But it's a type of literature, and usually some sort of commentary on being colonial at some point as well. And then there's, I also included a link within American literature to African American literature, so that's also there below too. So just things that might spark your interest if you wanted to look at analysis and how you would approach analysis of those different genres of writing. That's available as well. And they do have some authors that you can check out too through those links. So let's look at what is a literary analysis and then how can we approach it. So a literary analysis is an informed written analysis and evaluation of work of literature, and it's often based on a literary theory. And in terms of what an analysis is, I like to think of it if you were looking at a painting. So, you know, we have all probably seen some sort of painting, whether it's from our niece or nephew or Vincent van Gogh. You've probably seen some paintings in your lifetime. And when you look at a painting, you can look at it from lots of different perspectives, whether it's just an aesthetic, do I like it or not, or a more detailed look at the brush strokes, look at the style, look at what different influences the artist had, but you look at it from a perspective in some way, whether that is your personal opinion of the work or it could be based on some sort of viewpoint. And that's what we really are doing with analysis of literature. We're going to look at a work and reflect on that work through a specific lens. And that lens is what's called literary theory. It's different perspectives that you would approach a work of literature with. Now, we're not just reading for entertainment value, but we are reading to analyze. So we're also going to have our eyes open. So we're going to pay attention to the details of the works. That's when I think about this particular assignment, I think that our different papers that we've written so far could really help in the development of this paper, because you think about, we wrote a sensory essay, so that taught you to write through your 5 senses, which is actually the use of imagery, metaphor, simile, those types of things when you are writing. So you can implement your knowledge of that style of writing to look at a different piece of literature. Then we went into narrative, which talked about, what is a narrative? It's a story. It has certain structures and those things. So you learn to write through that lens, which you can apply your knowledge about narrative to a piece of literature. And then even compare and contrast, because when we look at the compare and contrast essay, you had to not only just say this is the same and this is different, but you had to bring the work to some sort of conclusion. So what is better? Perhaps you also came up with a significant meaning based on those comparisons. So you had to go beyond just the basics of this is the same and this is different, and actually come up with some sort of analysis is really what you were doing. So we can apply all the skills that you have developed so far in the class to the literary analysis paper. And when we look at literary theory, there's a lot of different kinds, and we're not going to go over every single one. And these are really broad perspectives on each one. I mean, I took classes in college that were based on one particular theory for the entire course. So you can really dive deep into each of these subjects, but we're just going to kind of give an overview. And if one strikes you as interesting, you can do further research as you create your literary analysis in that particular theory. So the essential characteristics of literary theories, keep in mind that they are a means to understand the various ways people read and connect with texts. So I think that's important to pay attention to the perspective there. It's not talking about the way an author writes, but it's an understanding of how we read and connect to those works. And these are the lenses through which we can see a text. So we put on our different types of theory glasses and we look at the text through that perspective, just like we would look at a painting through a certain perspective. Usually, creating a whole new perspective when you start to dig deeply into a work. So it goes beyond just entertainment. It really gets into analysis, and it can open your eyes to new things, and it can open your reader's eyes to a new way to approach a text. So I just want to go over some different examples. Now this first one is the archetypal criticism, and it's basically what a lot of students will probably approach the work through. So these are when you look at symbols, myths, motifs, characters, and situations that are archetypes. So these are things that you would see in lots of different literature. So this is something that people enjoy because you are creating a text-to-text analysis. So you're looking at one work and what does it remind you of? What kind of stories does it remind you of? What kind of myths does it remind you of? So these are archetypes in literature. So for instance, one thing you could do is look at the hero, right? So if you look at a particular story and there is a hero character, how does that hero character relate to a hero from Greek mythology, or the typical hero that you would see in all of the, Marvel movies? So what is the typical hero? How does the character in the story relate to the typical hero? So you're taking what you know about background things like myths and motifs and symbols, things that are prevalent in society, things that are prevalent in literature, and applying those to a specific work. And they're generally called archetypes. One form that really made me stumble when I was in school was formalism. Now, this is also called new criticism or structuralism, and I think that it was hard for me because it really took away that ability to connect as a self to a work. Because what formalism does is it makes you analyze a work just for the work itself. So if archetypal type of criticism looks at motifs and symbols and myths and kind of makes this whole world look at a work, well, formalism says don't do that. look at the work for itself. So only analyze the work within itself. It doesn't need context. We don't need to know about the author. We don't need to know what the author had for lunch the day he wrote it. We just look at the aesthetics, the language, the interaction of words, the figures of speech, the symbols within the particular work. This type of criticism works really well with poetry. And I think that a formalist critic would say that it is the preferred literature of choice for formalists is poetry. And it does make it easier because poetry in itself lends to analyzing every little word, right, and how the words interact with each other. So that's something that you can think about if you're going to look at poetry, and it may fit you really well. It just didn't fit me very well, but I learned it and it was great, but it was more difficult than the others for me. This is one I really like, which is called historical criticism. And this is where you reflect on the author's or the character's life and times. So you're going to put the work within a historical perspective, whether that's in the perspective of the author, him or herself, and their place in history, or the way that the characters are portrayed in their place in history. And this works better for short stories and novels and things rather than poetry. Although we can apply it to poetry, especially in narrative poetry like we talked about last week in the discussion board with the Robert Frost poem, understanding the culture and historical perspective could definitely help you have a different perspective on the poem. So it will be necessary to do outside research for this particular criticism because you'll need to know about the author, you'll need to know about the context, so the political, the economical, the sociological context of the author's times and how that would apply to the story and to what is being portrayed in the work. So I really like this particular criticism because I enjoy history, so that's just something that I find fun. So if you like history, this might be one to look at because, for instance, I have always disliked Charles Dickens, and that's horrible as a literature major, I understand. But it's hard to get into his writing for me. It might have something to do with my first connection to Charles Dickens' work. I read Tale of Two Cities when I was in high school and I didn't get it, so that might have put a slant on my Dickens perspective. But when I read Dickens' Hard Times novel, and it was presented in a historical context, so I learned about how Dickens interacted within his political sphere, what his books did for the culture that he worked in, how he was a writer for the people, and his publications were available in short paperback volumes, and it was accessible to the masses when before books were very limited to those that had the money to buy them. So it's expensive to buy a leather-bound printed book. So when Dickens wrote, those works became very accessible to the masses. He had a large impact on his culture, and what he was writing about was about the people that he was who was reading his works. So getting that historical perspective made me appreciate Charles Dickens a lot more once I learned that element. So this is a cool way to look at literature, at least from my perspective, and it may even give you a new glance at something you might not have liked before, which it did for me. This is one that I see a lot of students doing because it's something that we feel comfortable with, similar to the archetypal criticism, which is reader response criticism. This is based on the reader's role in the development of the interpretation. So it's with the idea that once a writer publishes a work and has someone read it, it is now outside of the writer's frame of reference. The reader has complete control in creating meaning in the work that is written. It is kind of subjective. So subjective is when we have our own opinion. Your reader response might be completely different than, Bob's reader response down the hallway. So it is your interpretation is very important to the reader response criticism. Now it needs to go beyond things like, I really liked it because of this, but reader response is going to develop interpretation based on their own experiences. So for instance, this is a text to self kind of criticism. So my personal connection to Dickens really stems from that first time I read a novel in high school by Charles Dickens, and so my response to his work may even be really seeped into what I was like in high school, because that was my first initial connection to Dickens. So my interpretation of Charles Dickens may be completely different from someone that had a positive first impression of Charles Dickens. So looking at your own personal life and your experiences would then develop an interpretation on the book or the poem or the short story based on those experiences. So it really empowers the reader. But we want to move beyond things just like, I liked the book because it was cool, or I liked this poem because it made me sad, or whatever. So we need to actually connect deeply with the text in order to really fit into this reader response criticism. A few others, so these are less common, but mimetic, which is real world reality. So we're looking at how works portray morality, the norms, the values of society, and then intertextual is when you compare the work with other literature. So this kind of gives a breadth of literature. So for instance, if you were to read a modern African American poem, you could then go back and make a connection to a Langston Hughes poem, or basically connecting one text to another text and showing how those connections have a real advantage to getting a further understanding of the work. This really works well with authors that who were influenced by other authors. I think of contemporaries of one another. And one of the things I really like to think of is Percy and Mary Shelley. So Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, but her husband was actually a very popular poet at the same time. And they obviously ran in the same circles. And so their works can somewhat be seen as interconnected. You can look at this in the same way if you choose several feminist writers. So like Kate Chopin, you might choose her, and you might choose, names are eluding me, Gertrude Stein. So if you chose multiple authors within the same genre, that might be a good way to do an intertextual criticism. So it's kind of like a compare and contrast, but you're doing it with pieces of literature. Feminist criticism is rather interesting. it talks about the impact of gender on writing and reading. It critiques patriarchal society, and also in terms of cultural and economic disability. So you're looking at the roles of women in history and how the patriarchal type of society has affected those roles or affected literature. A work that really impacted me in the realm of feminist writing made mention of if Shakespeare would have had a sister that was as much a genius as he was, would she have been as famous as him? Probably not, because women at that time period were discouraged from doing anything of academic value. So first of all, she wouldn't have even been able to be an actor like Shakespeare was, because women were not allowed to act. They thought it was lewd if women were in plays and things. And women were corseted and kept in the home, and they had to learn embroidery and that kind of stuff. So having a creative outlet would have been very difficult for a woman during the 1600s. So looking at feminist criticism is looking at a work from that perspective. How does history connect with women's roles, and how did that impact writing and reading? Marxist criticism is a form of political criticism or theory. This is the relationship between socioeconomic classes, so class systems, and how the masses affect the outcome of things. And one really great work to analyze with Marxist criticism is Julius Caesar, because if you've read that in high school, or we're so lucky to see it as a play, the idea and the emotional aspect of the play is often interpreted by the way the masses react to the main characters. So it's that mob mentality. So Marxist criticism would work really well with that particular work. Other things include psychological and psychoanalytical criticism. So this is taking psychology, if you're interested in psychology, so taking the works of Freud and Jung and psychological motivations of characters. So you're analyzing characters as a psychologist kind of viewpoint. So how do psychoanalytical ideas relate to literature? So you're kind of jumping between different types of sciences and looking at literature through that perspective. So when we look, sorry, this is all oddly, I have to wait for me to click all the buttons. So when we look at a literary work, we can take a lot of different angles. And this chart kind of shows these angles. So the literary work is here in the center, as we can see. And if you look at the literary work through the lens of the author's life and the author's world, that would be historical or biographical. If you look at it from the point of other literature, that's intertextual. If you look at the literary work through the audience, that relates to reader response. And if you look at the literary work through the real world or beyond the world, that's when we get into mimetic, archetypal, and then we have some that kind of connect to multiple elements. So feminists and Marxists look at the work through the author's world and through the real world perspective. Formalist looks just at the literary work, and so it doesn't even kind of go off of any of these other things. So when we look at literary criticism, we look at look at a piece of literature through a certain perspective, whether that's relating it to the real world, to the author, to other literature, to ourselves. Each time that we approach a work, we analyze it through a lens. So one of these lenses. hopefully one of them inspired you or at least caught your attention and might make you think about how to incorporate that into your own ideas for a literary analysis. So I hope that this helps as we move forward. I will continue to be posting throughout the week, obviously, and setting up our week 9. So keep on the lookout for the quiz and the vocabulary list, also the discussion board. Be sure to participate in that. And we will see you in the classroom. So thank you very much and have a great week.